I would like to say hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Naomi Stokes, and I am the Project Support Assistant at Work in Culture. For those of you who are joining us today and are not familiar with us, Work in Culture is a non-profit arts service organization focused on supporting the career development of artists and people who work in the arts. I'm joined today by my colleague, Brianne D'Angelo, who will be providing us with tech support. We work towards bridging the professional development and business skills gaps in the arts and culture sector in support of all disciplines and creative practices. Now, most people know us for our very popular job board, which is curated specifically for the arts and culture community, but we are so much more than that. We conduct workforce research, we create and host career resources, and we adapt and deliver training such as the programming that you are part of today. This webinar is part of WIC celebrating 25 years of service to the sector. Even though we are mandated to serve Ontario, through the changing digital space, we are so grateful that we get to do this work throughout Canada and beyond, giving us the opportunity to work with people from a variety of places and communities. However, most of our team and our office spaces are here in Toronto. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the historic territory of the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge that Toronto is under Treaty 13, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. So a few housekeeping notes before we get going. We will be recording the first half of the webinar and will be sending it around to those who registered. The question and answer section of this webinar will not be recorded to create a safe space for those who wish to speak during this section. If at any point throughout the webinar you have a thought or a question that pops up, please feel free to use the chat and we will address all questions during the Q&A part of the session. If you wish to receive a transcript of all the questions asked, you can email me or Brianne and we will be happy to share it with you. If you are looking to gain a better understanding of the sector, please do check out Working in the Arts. That was a work in culture program that we ran. This program page has panel discussion, videos, blogs, and other resources to help you get better acquainted with the arts and culture sector. You can also sign up for the Working in the Arts newsletter that highlights various resources and opportunities for newcomers. You can find the link to the page and the e-news sign up link in the chat. Your feedback and thoughts help us make our programming better, so please do lend us your thoughts. The survey link will also be added to the chat. Without further ado, I am excited to introduce your co-facilitators for this afternoon. We are honored to have the WIC Board Chair, Mike Rudolph, and Secretary Estefania Rigada leading this session today. Mike Rudolph is an HR professional who specializes in full-cycle recruitment, employee relations, performance management, and compensation design. He has worked for several organizations, including the Toronto International Film Festival and Mars Discovery District, and has been a member of the board of directors of Inside Out LGBTQ+ Film Festival since 2019. Mike is a certified professional coach through the Coactive Training Institute and specializes in career and leadership training. He holds the Certified Human Resources Professional designation with the Human Resource Professional Association. During her time at TIFF, Steph worked on various areas of HR, including recruitment, onboarding, training, and development, and HR metrics. Following her time at TIFF, Steph moved on to Cineflix, a television production company. In that role, she supported HR initiatives across all productions in Ontario, with a strong focus on health and safety and HR systems. Since 2017, Steph has been an HR business partner at HarperCollins Canada and Harlequin, one of publishing's big 5 editorial houses. In this role, Steph is responsible for a wide range of HR accountabilities, including recruitment, employee relations, compensation, performance management, culture and engagement, diversity, and special projects. Steph currently teaches HR at Sheridan and Humber College. Over to both of you, Mike and Steph.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to talk to you about this exciting topic. Like Naomi said, Steph and I are going to take you through navigating the job application process in the arts. Making sure I can move my slides. There we go. Okay, we're going to start off by talking about understanding job postings. And then we're going to talk about writing resumes and cover letters, touch on some interview skills, and like Naomi said, then leave some time for Q&A, because I'm sure we'll have lots of questions on this large topic. So maybe to start things off, I'm going to pass it over to Steph, and she can take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I'll give you a moment too. Can I do the slides too? No. There we go. Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we're going to start with understanding job postings. There's a couple topics, well, more than a couple topics we're going to go through. And if we go to the next slide, we're going to chat a little bit about what's important. So if you are looking for work in the arts, you might be a little bit overwhelmed with, okay, what am I paying attention to? What's important in a job posting? So that's what we want to answer a little bit first. So when you look at a job posting, the list of qualifications can be really extensive, and it can be, again, very overwhelming. Think of the qualifications as kind of like that blue sky scenario of like the ideal candidate that an organization is looking for. Don't be too concerned if you're not meeting all the qualifications. We're going to chat about that in a sec. The main piece or the main takeaway here is that not all the qualifications are made equal, and should not think that they're all equal. So in terms of best practice, qualifications would be listed from the most important to, I would say not important, but like less important, let's say. So from most important to the least important, let's say. So for example, if you are looking at a job posting that you're interested in, and let's say they have 12 qualifications, which unfortunately can happen, they have a long laundry list of things, don't be too concerned about, am I meeting all 12? My advice is, like, for example, when I'm recruiting and looking for candidates and I'm screening candidates, I'm focusing ideally on the first 4 to 5 bullet points in a qualifications section. Now, keep in mind the qualifications on a job posting, it might not be called qualifications. It might be, say, what you bring to the table or something like that, but it's the same thing. It's basically all the skills that they're looking for from a candidate, okay? So typically, like I said, I'm looking at the first 4 to 5 qualifications. The assumption is that they've been listed in order of priority, and those are really the ones that I want to make sure that my candidates are meeting before I move them on to the next stage of the recruitment process. So again, don't be too concerned if there's 12, 14, 15 qualifications. It's okay if you don't meet everything. Still apply for the job, especially if you're starting out your career. You might not have everything. It's okay. There's a lot of transferable skills that can actually be applied to qualifications. We're going to talk about that in a moment. One thing that's really interesting about who applies based on the qualifications listed on a job posting is that there's some stats that show women will only apply for a job if they meet 100% of all the qualifications listed on a job posting, which is pretty extreme. On the other side, men tend to apply for jobs if they meet about 60% of the qualifications. So there's this idea, it seems to trend at least, that women will not apply if they don't meet everything, because they figure, what's the point? I'm not going to get the job. I'm not meeting all 12 qualifications. But again, from a recruiter perspective, don't stop yourself. It can still be that you're a great candidate, even if you don't meet everything. And when I'm recruiting, I'm thinking about, can that be trained later, right? So if you are meeting the main qualifications that I'm looking for, let's say those really strong 3 to 5, let's say, everything else, can we train that person on that? So there is flexibility. Don't stop yourself from applying to a job just because you don't meet 100% of the qualifications. Now, what's important, you might see that some job postings, particularly in the arts, might say, they want someone that's worked in the arts already. That's a lovely cherry on top, but don't stop yourself from applying to a job just because you don't have arts experience. You're going to have opportunities to really show your passion and your desire to work in the arts through cover letters and things like that. So don't stop yourself from applying to an arts job, even if it says on the qualifications that they would prefer someone with that experience, because you can talk about why it's meaningful to you, why you want to work in the arts, what you know about the program that they offer, and how you can add value to that. And a lot of times you can actually transfer skills from other sectors to the arts. So again, totally fine. Never stop yourself from applying to a job if you know that there's a solid foundation there that you're meeting.
I just
Mike,
add one thing.
yeah, of course. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, the thing about the 4-5 bullets, like the number one, like the first bullet, which is the most important. I'm finding what people are doing too is they often tend to put education first, even if
Yeah.
education's not the most important thing. I mean, education's important, but let's say you're applying for a patron service role or the role that we're going to be looking at, this event coordinator role. People just tend to default to putting the education first, even if transferable skills or experience is actually going to be more important than your education in this particular area. So again, don't let the education part throw you off, because it's just a tendency that people do to put it first.
That's very true. Most jobs will have the education and then years of experience. So that's very true. Just to start kind of giving you context or anchoring the conversation a little bit, we pulled a job. It's the program and special events coordinator. And just again, so that we're all on the same page, what a job posting might look like. So you have typically job description. It kind of explains day-to-day responsibilities of the job, and then you have the key responsibilities. So like those really kind of more narrow, more focused tasks that you might be responsible for. Pretty typical job posting. And by the way, if you are reading this and it's interesting, it is currently posted on the Working Culture job board. So I encourage you to check it out if what you're reading is interesting. But again, it was just to give you a context as we walk through the content. Mike, can I get you to go to the next slide now? Okay, so this is the qualifications attached to the job that we were looking at. So as you can see, they have I wouldn't call it a laundry list. This is pretty reasonable when we think about qualifications. I really like, for example, they separated between those qualifications on the assets. Assets, let's talk a little bit about that. Don't be too concerned about the assets, right? The assets is a little bit more of that blue sky. So if you don't meet the assets, that's okay. Like, that should not stop you. Qualifications, again, if I'm recruiting for this role, I'm probably looking at the first few bullet points there, the time management, multitasking, those skills. I'm probably looking at about the 2 years of experience, the communications, prioritization, problem solving. Those are really going to be the things that I'm going to be focusing a lot of my attention when I'm looking at the resumes that are coming in, okay? And then under assets, as you can see, for example, knowledge of and passion for the Canadian screen-based media industry. That's great. You can demonstrate your passion in other ways. And again, I don't want to steal Mike's thunder a little bit, but he's going to chat a little bit about that. But you can definitely demonstrate that in other aspects if you are new to the arts and you don't currently have that experience. Same thing at the end. This is very common for the arts. They are going to want to see that connection or that interest in their mandate, their programming, their services, their mission and vision, and so forth. I think that's it for me for this one, Mike. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Steph. So I'm going to be talking about some of the job boards that you can be looking at, and then taking that from the application process into building your resume and your cover letter. So obviously, we're going to talk about, as Naomi mentioned, Working Culture is probably most famous for its job board, although it does a lot of other great programming. So Working Culture is going to be your best bet to get a variety of different job postings and also volunteer opportunities across the country. Also, if there's specific organizations that you're interested in, they obviously also have their own job boards as well. So, I mean, other than going to an aggregate place like Working Culture, going directly to, just to use, WIFT, for example, that job was probably posted on their own job posting as well. A lot of post-secondary schools will have job postings and opportunities for grads and soon-to-be grads. The only catch there is that, of course, you probably have to be a student to have access to those. But if you are a student and you are graduating, or if you recently graduated, definitely check out your institution's job boards, because they do post a lot of things, especially related to this the sector. LinkedIn, Glassdoor, ZipRecruiter, Indeed, all of these places, are obviously very massive. I would say they're not the best place to find arts organizations job postings, because they they're expensive, number one, to post in, and number two, they tend to get bogged down. People who can pay to get things elevated and all of those things, they tend to get, that tends to rise to the top, and nonprofits and arts organizations don't. So you really kind of have to sift through a lot of different things to find exactly what you're looking for. So obviously they're a resource, but I would say something more specific to the arts, like work and culture, is going to be a better bet. And then there's also a lot of, if you know that you want to work in a specific sector in the arts, for example, Media Job Search Canada is a job board that has a lot of film and television related opportunities. And then Steph mentioned Quill Inquire is that specifically for the publishing? Steph?
Yes, it will be more for a type of editorial type of jobs. We use it quite a bit for that.
Yeah, so those are just two. Me being in the media, Steph being in publishing, those are two kind of sector specific ones. But I'm sure lots of others, depending on whatever sector you're in, there's lots of different opportunities there. Okay, so let's talk about reading a job posting. So Steph kind of introduced the topic of the job posting and how to look through it. I think what we want you to do when if you're taking away something is really, look at the job posting and picture yourself in how are you going to add value to this role. So when you're reading a job posting, it is just kind of sometimes a laundry list of tasks, like Steph mentioned. But really, what you want to think about is, do you see yourself in this company? Steph mentioned the values of the organization and things like that. So, in that job posting, it mentioned, having supporting WIF's mandate. How do you feel like you can support WIF's mandate? If you actually go on a lot of organizations' websites, they will have their mission and their vision and their values online, probably in some sort of annual report and things like that. That's a great way to look at an organization, get to learn a little bit more about it, and understand how you can add value and how your own personal values align with the organization's. So, and if you look at an organization and even you might love the job, but then you realize like, hey, this doesn't really fit for me, like, well, then maybe listen to that voice inside your head and say, like, instead of trying to really force yourself to get excited about a role, maybe there's another role out there for an organization that better aligns with who you are. Looking at things like, do they mention things that matter to you? How are you going to really how are they going to talk about what to expect in the interview process? To mention salary expectations. These are all things that help you decide if this is going to be a good fit for you. Especially another thing, around lately, of course, is remote work. If you really love remote work and you do not want to work in an office, 4 or 5 days a week, they should put that in the job posting. And if they don't, that's a great question to ask in the interview process. But these are all things that you should think about before you apply to a job. The other thing is make sure you're reading the instructions. I can't say how many job candidates that we've had to say no to because they can't follow simple instructions. If we say in the job, let's say for example, it says a cover letter, and let's say in the cover letter requirements it says talk about how you will support WIF's mandate, to use that organization again, and don't do that. That really knocks you. It's a really way to knock people out. I mean, especially when an organization gets hundreds and hundreds of resumes for one job posting. So make sure you're following all the instructions. Make sure if you're especially in the arts, including links to portfolios or examples or other projects that you've worked on. Make sure you're following all of those requirements, because even great candidates will get knocked out. Especially if one of the requirements is attention to detail. Okay, and so you might have heard of what an applicant tracking system. So this is these are platforms used by organizations to post jobs, to review candidates and communicate with candidates, and send offers. So these are really, really helpful to HR professionals like me and Steph. We both had to use email as our applicant tracking system at a previous organization. That is, especially when you get hundreds and hundreds of applications for one job, that's really time consuming. So these are really helpful. The reason why I want to tell you about them is because they will often be used by HR teams in smaller arts organizations. They're not completely automated, I would say. Sometimes people think of these systems who are reading every single resume word for word and knocking people out based on certain keywords. I wouldn't say they're that sophisticated. At least the ones that I'm using aren't that sophisticated. But what I want to tell you is just that keywords are important. And so sometimes you'll get what an ATS, applicant tracking system, will do is review and rate a resume based on certain keywords or experience or things like that. So it's really important that you're using the same vocabulary that they have in the job posting in your cover letter and your resume. And it's also very important by that token to tailor your resume and your cover letter to a job. Just don't, I'm going to say this a lot, don't just, search, find, replace job titles and organizations in your cover letter, because we know when you've done that. So for example, to go back to the job posting that Steph showed, using the exact language of the job posting, so time management, multitasking, organizational, verbal and written communication skills, take those exact phrases and put them into your your cover letter and your resume when you're writing them. Now, I wouldn't just exactly say like, I have excellent time management, multitasking, and organizational skills. Like that's just, repeating what's in the job posting. But what I want you to do is take the key words and the ideas and make sure you're touching on all of those, or at least 4 or 5 of those bullet points in the qualifications explicitly in your resume and your cover letter, because that's what an applicant tracking system will use to review and potentially rank your application. Okay, let's get into more around cover letters and resumes. Okay, so cover letters are probably not as prevalent as they used to be, but they are still a requirement to some people's chagrin. But really, if you think of a cover letter, and I think this is one of the things that is exciting about applying to jobs in the arts specifically, is that we can really use this as an opportunity to tell our stories. Talk about, when you're working in the arts, it's because you have a passion or a love or an interest or a connection to the sector or the organization that you're writing, that you're applying to. So use your cover letter not just to reiterate your resume in text as opposed to bullet points. Really use it to tell your story. Going through that process that I talked about earlier and looking at the organization and connecting to your values and what inspires you to work there. So really talk about, why do you want to work there? How does it connect to your values? What will you add? And also, what do you want to be? Organizations, especially arts organizations, want to invest in people and see people grow and thrive. And so I think if you say like, I am so excited to be part of WIF's mandate, and I see myself, taking this event coordinator role and expanding it into be the, to have a better impact on events all across the country, whatever, that's off the top of my head. But, that really just talk about, what's your blue sky for this role? Why do you want to work there? Because that's the stuff that, as recruiters, Steph and I want to see. Cover letters should be no longer than a page. Keep it simple. But make sure you cover everything you want to cover. I would say 2 to 3 paragraphs. As again, we can always tell when you do a find and replace, because sometimes you forget to to replace the title or the organization. And I've seen that many, many, many times where someone's like, I'm applying for this, donor relations role, and I'm like, this isn't a donor relations role. So this just shows that the person hasn't put any thought or effort to tailoring the cover letter to the company. One little thing that can get you points is, don't do "to whom it may concern" or "dear recruiter," anything generic like that. Do a little bit of research. So let's say that, again, using this WIF role, the special events coordinator reported to the director of events. Go on LinkedIn and do a little research, or go on their website and find out. I mean, if again, an annual report is a really good way of finding who does what in an organization. So if you have these resources at your fingertips, find a name and just say, and even if it's the wrong name, it doesn't matter. It just shows that you put a little effort in. Or find the HR person. We love to say, hey, dear Mike Rudolph. I'm like, oh, that's me. I know it sounds a little simple, but it just shows that you put a little bit of more effort into the cover letter. A question that probably a lot of you are thinking is, can I use ChatGPT or any other AI tool to write a cover letter? I think you can, but use it as a tool. Don't use it as your one source of to write all your cover letters. So if you just type in, make me a cover letter for an arts organization that does this, don't just do that. I have used it to reword paragraphs to make them more concise. I've used it to say, can you, yeah, basically that's what I've used. But we can always tell when you've used AI to write it. It's pretty robotic. But I think, you really don't want to take away from this opportunity to put yourself into the cover letter. So use it like a tool, use it like spell check, but don't use it to be the only source that writes your cover letters. Okay, moving on to resumes. So obviously there's some certain things that'll knock your resume off from, our reviewing it right off the bat. So look at doing things like spelling mistakes, formatting errors. You always put your resume into a PDF. Don't send a Word document or anything like that. It just makes it look sloppy, and it sometimes does, especially in an applicant tracking system. Sometimes it formats weird. Your best bet is to do it in a PDF. Make sure you review the PDF, because sometimes if you've downloaded it from Google Docs or whatever to a PDF, it still screws things up a little bit. So just take your time to make sure that it looks good. And take out, be formal. This is not, this is a formal opportunity. So, you don't want to use things like curse words. I have seen curse words in resumes before, and cover letters actually. Other things to consider, things that we wouldn't want to see is things when you're not tailoring it to a role. If you're a junior person, we don't need to see every single job you've ever had. You really want to just make sure that you are focusing on the ones that are most relevant. So, if you worked in retail for 10 years in high school, actually around 10 high school for 10 years, but if you have given it, this is not a retail role, you don't necessarily need to include it. Now, if you have transferable skills from that role, like being a manager or a key holder or leadership skills, then definitely include it. But yeah, if you don't feel like there's a way that to include your experience that makes sense, don't feel like you have to include your entire life history into a cover letter. Just keep it simple, keep it legible, and keep it specific to the skills you want to highlight. I like a summary section at the beginning, just a little kind of snapshot of who you are. What I don't like, and I think that Steph agrees with me, is the objective. Because oftentimes people will say, my objective is to become, the special events coordinator for WIFT. Yeah, we know that. That's why you're applying to the role. Use this as an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit of a highlight from your cover letter. So some of the values you've talked about, think of it as like a movie trailer, like, oh, I can't wait to learn more about this person. If you've done any, things like StrengthsFinder or Myers-Briggs, maybe you put that in there. Things that just kind of make you stand out a little bit. That doesn't necessarily have to do with your direct experience, work experience. Now, there's many different ways of doing a cover letter. The most common one is chronological, where you've just basically listed your work in order. Usually it's the most recent job you've had first and the least recent you've had last. This is pretty, if you've had pretty consistent, steady employment, or you've moved up consistently, this is going to be a really easy way of designing it. It tells a story. It shows you how you've grown through your career throughout the years. The only issue, and honestly, like gaps in your resume, like that's another common question we get. It's not at the end of the world. We all have gaps in our resumes for whatever reason. But it just, when you do it chronologically, that gap can be highlighted, I guess, is kind of a downside. And it's also not great for explaining transferable skills. So if I see jumping from, manager at a clothing store to events coordinator at an arts organization, that maybe doesn't read as easily as another way of designing it. So yeah, it's not so great for highlighting transferable skills sometimes. This one is more about transferable skills. It's a skill-focused resume. It's called a functional resume. So basically, what you would do is say, here are all the skills that I've developed or things that I've accomplished. And you can even bunch them together. So you could say like, customer service experience, communication skills, leadership skills. And then you can just basically put those all together, bucket them together. And at the bottom, you talk about, maybe some of the other, you could say other work experience. So you're really focusing on the functional part of your experience. This is great for people who maybe, if you've had a lot of maybe experience in post-secondary institutions, but not formal work experience, this is a really good way of highlighting some of the skills that you've developed. I think it's great to include those, that experience in your resume. Those are all valid and transferable skills, but it maybe is a little easier to organize them than in a chronological one. And then there's a hybrid one where you kind of take a little bit of both. So you maybe put the skills at the top and then some of the more work experience at the bottom. This is really good for people who, if you really want to target for a specific role, if you have a lot of work experience, but you don't feel like you want to include everything. I do this with my my volunteer and extracurricular stuff. I want to include that in my resume, but I don't want to necessarily bunch that together with my in my chronological order of my resume. You know what? I think the real takeaway here is that resumes are, I always say, resumes are like fingerprints. They're all pretty individual. Tailor it to make what makes sense for you. We just want to, again, see a story, find out who you are and what you're bringing to the table. There's no one way to write a resume. There's no right way to write a resume. But some things to talk about. You want to tailor it to wrap it up. Tailor the resume to the role. Take things out of the job description, use that as inspiration. Again, inspiration, not copy paste from the job description. Don't feel like you have to include everything, but do include things like transferable skills. Think of the competencies that you're going to be using. So again, leadership skills, communication skills, customer service skills. Those are maybe you've developed outside of the arts or outside of a role that's exactly like the one that you're applying for. Please definitely include them. What did you learn from your retail, your hospitality experience that you can bring to this role? And then when you're writing your bullet points, use action-oriented words: delivered, executed, researched, produced. Make sure that you're considering the tense. So this is also a common question we receive. It just looks sloppy when there's a tense shift. So I like to just keep the tenses consistently through the entire resume. Make sure that you are not just writing a list of duties, though. What was your impact? What were some of the metrics or use that as a word. What are some of the numbers or kind of the hard results of what you've done? So for this program and a special events coordinator, you could say you increased the number of attendees by X%. Or your event satisfaction scores went up by 4 or 5% every year, or you had a reduction of the response time for communications, or as opposed to just saying I replied to emails in a timely manner. It just sounds a little bit more action oriented, and that you had an impact on the role. And then also, think about your most relevant experience. It should have the most content. So again, to go back to your retail experience, if it's not the most relevant, maybe you only have 2 or 3 bullet points. But if you've been an event coordinator in a different role, that should have 6 or 8 bullet points. If you have similar roles, only detail the ones that are unique, with unique accomplishments. So if you've been an event coordinator in 2 or 3 different organizations, don't repeat yourself in the bullet points, because think about basically the real estate of the resume. You don't want to have like a 4-page resume. Assume if you've done your current role, you've done it in previous roles as well. And then just kind of to wrap things up, these are just kind of my opinion. As I said, resumes are unique. Steph and I probably have different preferences when it comes to what resumes look like and how they read. Make sure that they're legible. Don't do fancy fonts and stuff like that. Keep it easy. I really don't like graphics or big charts that kind of don't say anything. So unless it's really like a design role, keep it simple. No more than 2 pages long. Think about real estate. You can always play with margins or borders. You don't have to put your entire life contact information. Really, just all we need is your name, your email address, maybe a phone number. And then finally, take out the interest section. If you're reading and hiking and taking care of your cat, that's great, but it's not really relevant to the role. And I just think it wastes space. So, keep it to the job. Okay, Steph, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Mike, I just noticed there's a couple comments or questions in the chat. Maybe we go through the content and then we get back to them. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So we'll get back to the questions. But if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And then when we're done, we'll go to the chat and answer everything, regardless of what section it came from. Okay. So let's chat a little bit about the interviewing skills. So we feel a little bit more comfortable about what's important in job posting. We created a cover letter and we created a resume. Now let's talk a little bit about what will it look like if I get a call for an interview, let's say. Okay, awesome. Let me just move a little bit things in on my end because it's covering my screen. There we go. Okay, so this is what a really basic kind of recruitment process might look like. Over the years at different organizations that I worked at, we've kind of used very, very similar processes. So generally speaking, we start a recruitment process with the application screening. So you submit your cover letter and your resume, let's say, through the applicant tracking system, and a recruiter will typically review the resumes and compare them against the minimum qualifications. Again, we're not going to stop ourselves anymore from applying to the job just because we don't meet 100% of the qualifications. We're still going to go for it. Based on that degree of match that the recruiter's looking at, they will push candidates to, let's say, what we call the screening interview. So the screening interview is typically what you see as like that quick call. You're not getting really on a video call. You're not going in person. It tends to be less than 30 minutes. Typically, my screening interviews are about 20 minutes. I think 30 minutes would be the absolute max that I would schedule one for. And I'm really looking at some confirmation about their experience. I'm just maybe going through the resume with them and asking them questions about skill sets and things like that. Assuming that things go well, I connect with the hiring manager and make some recommendations. We might invite then more people to what we'd call the selection interview. So this is the one where you're actually going in. It could still be virtual. Some organizations are still recruiting virtually, so keep that in mind. I guess this one would have been the in-person interview. And here's the one where you're typically interviewing with the actual hiring manager, which is the manager for the position and the person that the role reports into. Typically, this is a little bit longer. It might be up to an hour. Some organizations will do panel interviews, meaning that you have more than one person interviewing. It might be the hiring manager, might be an HR rep, and it might be like a third person that's relevant. And some organizations will do serial interviews, meaning that you have one interview with the hiring manager, let's say, and then after that, you meet another member of the team or the HR rep or whatever. So the selection interviews will vary a little bit from organization to organization. Now, assuming that an organization is choosing to introduce a step, you might then see a test or assessment. And I put a little star next to assessment because this particular step might vary. Like it might go in different stages depending on what the role is. I know for my current organization, there's certain roles that we test before we actually even screen them on the phone. And then for other jobs, we only do testing and assessment after the selection interview. Okay, so keep that in mind. It will vary a little bit. Typically, after we've collected all the data that we can possibly collect relevant to the job, let's say, again, their application form, if there was one, cover letter, resume, the phone screen, the in-person interview, and the testing, then the hiring manager will make a decision. At this stage, then we send over to references. So typically, we only would conduct reference to the preferred candidate. References can be expensive and time-consuming. So typically, an organization will not ask you for references until they're basically ready to make you an offer. So if you are at the reference stage anywhere, it's a really, really good sign. You're almost there. And then once the references get cleared, you would get an offer. One thing to call out about references, it could be a couple things that they do that are common. So references might be contacting, past managers and getting a little bit of feedback about your performance, but it could also be employment verification and education verification if that's important to the job, right? So an education verification might mean that they get a request from the school that you graduated from, and they confirm that you actually received that degree, diploma, whatever, certification. And an employment verification would be contacting your previous employer. Typically, it's the HR department or payroll, and they'll confirm that the person, they worked here from those dates that they shared with you. And yes, they held that job. So it's not really related to like your skill set and your contributions and how you performed. It's strictly confirming kind of like dates, titles, and things like that. So that's typically what a references will look like. Okay, so let's say that we got through the entire process. Well, not the entire process, but we got through kind of like right before the interview, right? So I separated this stage between before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview, and some things to keep in mind. So before the interview, it's kind of related to even what Mike was saying earlier, but like doing a little bit of homework and being prepared. So review the job posting again, make sure that you truly understand what the job is all about, and make sure you understand how your skill set can match that. So think about those transferable skills that we talked about. Be prepared with those examples and those transferable skills. Practice common questions. Google is your friend. I've done this myself throughout my career. If I know that there's a particular job that I'm going after and I know that skill is very clearly outlined, very high, let's say, on those qualifications, I will go in and say, common interview questions for whatever skill, and I'll just practice a couple. It would be impossible for you to prepare for every single interview question. So again, focus on those key main qualifications that we kind of identified earlier, and just, practice, let's say, 2 different questions related to that skill. This might seem obvious, but please mind the logistics. I've had candidates go to a different tower for an interview. So there's 3 towers in downtown Toronto location where we're at HarperCollins, and a candidate called me in a panic because they couldn't find me, and they were literally in a different building. So it's really important that you know where you're going. If the organization happens to have multiple locations, that you actually know that you're going to the correct one, that you know where parking is, how long is it going to take you to walk from the parking lot to the office, all those things. Is there TTC? Will there be a delays with TTC? Those TTC alerts are your friends. And then checking. So who am I asking for at reception, for example? Who's going to be checking me in? And obviously make sure you're arriving between 5 to 10 minutes. I think the sweet spot is like about 10 minutes to check in. Anything before that, you're just going to probably hype yourself up a little bit and get really nervous just sitting at reception. So aim for about 10 minutes. If anything happens, you're still not going to be late. And then if they are doing still virtual interviews, which could happen, some organizations are still doing their selection interviews virtually. Please make sure you have access to reliable internet. I've had so many calls just drop in the middle of the interview and I cannot get a hold of the candidate again. So reliable internet access, make sure that you have headphones, your audio is working, you have a camera. If you know it's going to be through Teams, you can kind of pre-download Teams so it's like smooth sailing when you're joining the call. Also, please, I just be mindful of this, but don't take an interview at your local Starbucks, because I've had candidates do this and there's people running around behind them ordering coffee and it's super loud and I can't hear a word that they're saying as they're answering their questions. So if you are doing virtual, try to get a space that you're alone, you're not going to be interrupted, and it's quiet. And then obviously think about questions you want to ask the interviewer. So if there's something about the job that you're curious about, this is the time to really, again, as you go through the job posting, to kind of come up with some questions you want to ask. It also just shows that you've thought through the job and you're not just saying like, no, I don't have any questions. Like, it just shows that you've gone a little bit further than other candidates, let's say. Okay, so during the interview, I've had candidates do this in the past, and I think it's a great idea, but have a copy of your resume as a reference. It can be very stressful to be in an interview, right? Like maybe you're the perfect candidate for the role and you're still walking in there and being very nervous. It's fine. Have a copy of your resume. You can call it out to the recruiter or the hiring manager and say, I just have my resume as reference. I might just look at it to just kind of help my memory or trigger my memory a little bit. That's totally fine. I've had candidates come in with their notebooks and they ask, can I just jot down, as I was asking them questions, they wanted to kind of like call out different key points that I was making in the questions just to help them think through it. Totally fine. Think about the questions, and when you're trying to think about the answers of the STAR method. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So just pin that for a second, but always try to aim for the STAR method. Take your time. I would much rather, as a recruiter, have someone tells me I need a moment to think about it than someone that will answer right away and it's totally wrong. So it's fine. I know that's uncomfortable. Awkward silences in an interview. It's not the best of times, but trust me, it's much better that you take 30 seconds, think through some examples, and then share your answer. And then obviously ask the questions, right? The before stage, we talked about, think about some questions that you might want to ask. Here's when you want to make sure, what are the next steps? Is there going to be another interview? Are there a testing or assessments that you're going to be having? Do you reach out to candidates whether or not they get the job? When can I expect to hear from you? And then any questions that you have about the job, this would be a good time. I've had people ask me questions like, how will you measure success over the next 3 months, which I thought was a great question. So things like that show thought can go a long way. My little tip is like, you probably want to kind of close off your questions. I know I would only add like maybe 3 question tops. Like you don't want like 10 minutes of questions to the recruiter or the hiring manager, but you might want to ask, something that leaves them with a positive impression. So for example, what do you love the most about your job? Or what do you love the most about working here? Because it will kind of give them like a feel good moment, and that's how they'll remember you. So it's always a good way of closing that interview. And then obviously do what you can, when you're saying goodbye and whatnot, to reinforce your excitement for the role. In the arts, they really do care whether or not you are interested in what they're doing, in their mission, their programming, or anything like that. So reinforce that excitement, that passion, that connection that you have to whatever it is that they're offering. And then after, unfortunately, this doesn't happen that often anymore. I personally really enjoy getting thank you notes. It's just a nice little touch to make it effective. Obviously, it is a thank you for thank you for taking the time to meet with me. That was great. I'm excited about the role. Again, show that excitement for the role again. But when I've gotten really effective thank you notes, what they did, the candidates would address any gaps that became evident in the interview. So for example, if I asked a question and they said, what, I can't think of an example, or what, I'm not knowledgeable in this area, I've had candidates then do research, read articles, educate themselves on that topic. And then in their thank you note, they've said, what, I gave that more thought. I found this really cool article. I think you'll really enjoy it. I've now kind of learned more about this topic. I'm really looking forward for, being considered for this role. And it was a really nice way of addressing potential gaps that came up during the interview and demonstrate that they're willing to learn and kind of educate themselves in whatever it is that they don't have that maybe I asked about. So it's an effective way of using that thank you note. Okay. Just mindful of time now. I need to maybe chat a little bit quicker. There might be 3 types of questions that come up in interviews. So I just want to briefly prepare you for the 3 types of questions that come up a lot. There's more. These are just kind of like the 3 more common types of questions. So we see verification questions, behavioral questions, and situational questions. Behavioral are typically the questions that we asked during that screening call, those quick 20-minute calls, and they're more like fact checking. So I'm looking at the resume and I'm asking some questions to verify, you completed your education. What are some key skills that you're using right now? How is the current job that you have relevant to this one? Or what are some transferable skills? Very easy, straightforward. Second one is behavioral. You typically see behavioral questions during the selection interview, that in-person interview, and they really are trying to uncover more kind of like demonstrated skill set or demonstrated experience that you have. They tend to sound like, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of, right? And it's anchoring the candidate to past behavior because we assume they'll behave the same way in the future. We call those behavioral questions. There's a little star because they are pretty important. They do tend to come up quite a bit in interviews. So if you're preparing for interview questions, behavioral is the one that you really want to prepare for. And then situational mostly happen for the selection interviews. And it's more about figuring out your thought process. How would you handle tough situations? So the question is framed as a dilemma or a scenario, and everything's on fire. There's no perfect answer. There's going to be a lot of like, oh, what do I do? And you need to kind of take a moment and say like, okay, here's how I would approach that situation. And it's really, again, that problem solving that they're looking at and your thought process in terms of getting to a solution. And perfect. Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about common questions that come up quite a bit in the art sector. Again, I think we keep driving this point home, but there is a high interest in understanding, what is motivating the candidate to apply to our sector. Do their passions align to what we do? So your goal is really to demonstrate that interest in the organization and the job itself. So for example, going back to the job that we shared earlier, if I'm recruiting for that job, I would 100% ask, why are you interested in the program and special events coordinator? And what do you know about the work we do at Women in Film and Television, right? Every time I prepared for throughout my career, every time I prepared for a non-arts job, because I'm always geared toward arts, I'm always looking at their website and learning everything I can about their programming, services, whatever, and they never ask me, never. Yet every time I've applied to an arts job, I've always been asked those two questions. Why are you interested? What is your connection to our organization? What we do, our programming, and why this job, right? So really very, very common questions. And the last question, I was actually, in fact, asked that when I was applying at TIFF many, many years ago as an intern. What is your favorite movie? It was actually a question that I was asked there. And when I was applying to my job at Harper, what's your favorite book? Also a question for that interview as well. So again, there is a strong interest in understanding what drives you when you apply to the arts sector. Okay, and then let's chat a little bit about behavioral questions. Again, this goal is a little bit different. Here's when you're going to demonstrate those transferable skills. So going back to the qualifications listed for the program and special events coordinator, we highlighted a few, right? So we talked about time management, multitasking, event coordination, prioritization, problem solving. So again, if I'm creating questions for that interview, those are the key skills I would create interview questions based on. So if we go to the next slide, here's what it might look like. Okay, so if I'm measuring a candidate's time management skills and multitasking skills, I might ask something like, tell me about a time when you had to manage multiple competing priorities while working on a tight schedule. If I'm looking to measure their event coordination skills or experience, I might ask something like, tell me about a time when a major piece of an event fell through at the last minute. If I'm measuring prioritization, which is pretty similar to time management and multitasking, but I might ask something like, describe a time when you had to reprioritize quickly due to changing circumstances. And lastly, problem solving. Give an example of a time when you identified and solved the problem before it became urgent. Okay, so here's how we are going to be focusing. Minimum qualifications, we pull the main ones, we create questions based on that, and that's how we're going to be preparing for our interviews. Okay, very quickly now, I'm just very mindful of the time. We're a chatty bunch, Mike and I, but I talked a little bit about answering your behavioral questions with the STAR method. So the STAR method is S for situation, T for task, A for action, R for result. I know it's a lot to take in, and you're doing this very quickly after you get asked a question, but it's just a structure to help you really tell the full picture when you're answering the question. There's percentages at the bottom. It does just kind of give you an idea how much time you're spending at each stage. And please notice that A, action, is the bulk of your answer. So this is the part where you're going to really describe your experience, your actions, what steps you took to get to the R, that result. So the A, those actions, is really where you're going to shine in terms of those transferable skills. Remember, it might not be in the industry that is related to the arts, but that's okay. We're just strictly looking at the skills and how we can transfer them. So the A, that action, is where you're going to be telling us what are those skills that you already have. And then if we're looking at the next slide, and we can share these. I understand it's a lot. I'm not going to read it all, but it's just to give you an idea of what it might sound like, right? So if we're going back to the question, describe a time when you had to reprioritize quickly due to changing circumstances, we're going to use that S, that situation, to kind of explain the context. Think about it as S as the context of the situation where it came up. T as like the tasks. So what were your main responsibilities in that scenario or that situation? A, remember, this is the action. So something went wrong. And then what was the action that you took to address that situation? And then R, here's the result. It might sound really obvious, but you'd be shocked how many people just don't tell you. And the end result is that, I managed to get the design on time. The event went smoothly, the guest didn't know that anything had gone wrong. Like, it's shocking how many people just don't tell you how the situation ended. So please make sure you're walking through the entire STAR method. And we'll share this so that you can actually see, you can read it more with more time, because I'm just rushing through it right now. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Mike.